Universal Pictures' 2014 supernatural horror film Ouija didn't exactly sweep up awards nominations when it was first released. Critics and audiences were fairly harsh when it came to reviewing the movie. On Rotten Tomatoes, 6% of critics who saw the movie enjoyed it, and only 24% of audience members gave it a good review as well. If Rotten Tomatoes isn't your preferred review source, ratings across the board for Ouija were lukewarm at best. On IMDb, audiences gave the film a 4.5 out of 10 stars, and CinemaScore, a company that asks people literally leaving the movie theater to rate a movie, has audiences giving the film a C. So here's the thing, I liked Ouija. Especially the more that I've done research for the film for this video. Ouija had such an interesting journey to the big screen. It was originally conceived as a big budget supernatural adventure film that, had it gone this route, likely would have beaten Jumanji Welcome to the Jungle to the punch. That's right, the original idea for Ouija was announced all the way back in 2008. Universal and Hasbro struck a 6-year deal to have multiple properties at Hasbro adapted into movies. So games like Monopoly, Battleship, which did get adapted eventually, and yes, Ouija were all set to be turned into big screen films. When Ouija was first announced by the trades, Michael Bay, yes you heard that right, Michael Bay, was on board with his production company Platinum Dunes to produce Ouija. For those of you who aren't aware, Michael Bay is a producer in Hollywood known for his very particular style of films. They typically include A-list talent, teal and orange color palettes with an abundance of lens flares, explosions, loud action set pieces, insanely large budgets, and explosions. Wait, I already said that. Anyway, not much was said about the movie after 2008 until sometime in 2010 when, at first, the director of Taken was announced to be in talks with Universal to direct the film. Yes, the director of Taken, the Liam Neeson action film where Neeson goes batshit crazy and kills hundreds of people to rescue his kidnapped daughter, was the first director in talks to film Ouija, the movie based on a board game that lets you talk to the dead. Soon after this announcement, the trades announced that McG, director of action films such as the first two Charlie's Angels films from the early 2000s, had officially signed on to direct Ouija. The same time that McG was announced to direct the film, it was revealed that the writers of the 2010 Tron sequel had penned a script for the film. Even though Universal specifically said in their original announcement that Ouija wouldn't be like 1995's Jumanji, which involved a board game coming to life in the real world, the 2010 announcement with McG specifically described the film as a big-budget supernatural action-adventure film that would take inspiration from The Mummy and Indiana Jones. This is where I get really sad when researching this movie. Scouring the web for leaked scripts for the original Ouija film gives you nothing. I have to know what the original plot for Ouija was. Could you imagine a movie about the Ouija board that has people traveling the globe to find some ancient relic in a tomb that they only figured out from playing with the fucking Ouija board? Exactly how much influence would the film have taken from The Mummy and Indiana Jones? I guess I can only ever wonder. Anyway, the writers of Tron eventually had their script rewritten by a guy who wrote like way too many direct-to-video Disney films. Eventually, later in 2011, Universal announced that they were going to drop production on Ouija as the budget was skyrocketing to a crazy tentpole level. Michael Bay and team decided to see if they could get other studios to pick up the film that, even without a studio, had a new writer sign on to further polish the script. In early 2012, everything changed when it was announced that Michael Bay and his gang of producers had shopped the film back to Universal, and they now had a new player on their team, Jason Blum. Jason Blum is one of the most prolific producers in Hollywood history. If you don't know him, you've surely heard of his empire of low-budget horror films, many of which are produced by his studio Blumhouse Productions. Paranormal Activity, Insidious, Sinister, and Get Out are all a few noteworthy Blumhouse films. With this new announcement, it was revealed that the budget of Ouija would be slashed from a reported $140 million to a bare-bones $5 million. Things were quiet for a little while, and finally the new low-budget Ouija project had announced its writers and directors. Stiles White and Juliet Snowden, well known for penning the scripts for 2005's Boogeyman and 2012's The Possession. Casting for this version of Ouija was announced in late 2013, with filming starting that December. This would go on to be the version of Ouija that has now been released to the world. Well, sort of. Interesting production trivia for Ouija doesn't end with the movie finally being filmed. Apparently, Ouija originally wrapped filming sometime in early 2014. Then there was a test screening for the film that was received so poorly it caused Universal and Blumhouse to panic and order reshoots to be done for 50% of the movie. Now, I'm sure by 2019, even just the average moviegoer knows that reshoots aren't what people used to think they were. Reshoots are a common part of the filmmaking process, and they're so common they're typically included in the original schedule for a film. Nearly every Hollywood film goes through some kind of reshoot process. Typically, reshoots are a relatively small endeavor. Most of the time, the director wants to refilm a certain scene and add some new lines, or have the actors deliver the lines differently. Sometimes a small new scene may be added to bridge a gap in the plot that was only realized after watching a rough cut of the film. But then there's cases like Ouija where the initial cut of the film missed a mark so much that it needs to be redone entirely. Now, I wasn't at this test screening for Ouija, and it's never been revealed what the original plot for the first cut of the film was like, but I'm sure it couldn't have been that bad. Test audiences are known to be very dramatic when it comes to watching a test version of a film. Director David F. Sandberg, known for Lights Out and Shazam, recently put out a super interesting video about test screenings. In it, he basically says that because test audiences are seeing a movie for free and are encouraged to criticize it, audience members tend to overanalyze or nitpick the film. This is made all the more frustrating as the film is usually being shown in a very rough, incomplete stage. Given that over 50% of Ouija ended up being reshot, I think it's safe to say that a number of things likely happened. First, you have the overly critical test audience judging the film. Then you have the film's extremely low budget, which is in the hands of a first-time director, making the studio nervous. Finally, you have Michael Bay and company who will do anything to put out a film that is as loud and generic as possible. What's interesting about this original test version of Ouija is that it was actually cut into an early trailer for the film, which I will never forget seeing in theaters the opening weekend of the release for The Fault in Our Stars. Universal and Blumhouse trolled so many teenage girls that weekend, it's incredible. What a genius marketing tactic. Before I can talk further about the original version of Ouija, let's talk about the film as it was released into theaters. Ouija is a movie about Debbie, a girl who finds an old-ass Ouija board one day in her attic. Debbie is no stranger to the Ouija board. She and her best friend Lane used to play it as kids, which means Debbie knows that there are 3 rules for playing with the Ouija board. Never play alone, never play in a graveyard, and always say goodbye. Well, Debbie, being a silly teenager, decides to play with the board alone one day, and it actually works. Eventually, she contacts something that frightens her so much, Debbie burns the board in her fireplace. However, the board winds up coming back from the fire, and Debbie gets possessed and hangs herself with Christmas lights. After Debbie dies, Lane is having trouble moving on from her best friend's suicide. Lane finds the Ouija board at Debbie's house one day and wants to use it to contact Debbie so she can say goodbye to her. Lane has her best friend Isabel, her boyfriend Trevor, Debbie's boyfriend Pete, and her sister Sarah join her for a seance at Debbie's house. The friends contact a spirit they initially think is Debbie, but actually find out is a little girl named Doris who used to live in Debbie's house many years ago. After Isabel is mysteriously killed following paranormal activity that all of the friends experience, Lane decides to investigate just who Doris is and why Debbie found the Ouija board in her attic. We get an obligatory horror movie research scene where Lane discovers that Doris went missing decades ago, with Doris's mother being suspected to have played a part in her disappearance. Doris apparently had a sister named Paulina who conveniently happens to be staying in a nearby mental institution. Lane visits Paulina and she learns that Doris's mom was a medium who used to hold seances in Debbie's house. As Doris's mom became more skilled, she needed a vessel to give the spirits she was contacting a voice. Doing what all irrational psychic mothers would do in this instance, Doris's mom turned to Doris to use as the vessel. This caused Doris to be filled with what we can only assume to be dozens and dozens of spirits that began to possess Doris and cause her mother and Paulina to go insane. Paulina tells Lane that in order to stop the voices from talking through Doris, her mother killed Doris and sewed her mouth shut. Now Paulina believes that her mother is haunting Lane and her friends, and that Doris is the only one who can defeat Mother's spirit once and for all. Paulina suggests that Lane and her friends find Doris's body in the basement of Debbie's house and cut the stitches from her mouth to free Doris and allow her to banish her mother's spirit. Lane and her friends do just what Paulina told them to, and Doris defeats her mother's spirit, sending it off to another realm. However, in a twist, Pete is killed shortly after this in his home by Doris's spirit. Lane goes back to Paulina for more advice, and she realizes that Paulina, the elderly woman in a wheelchair at a mental asylum, is actually batshit f***ing crazy and lied to Lane. The spirit of Doris and Paulina's mother wasn't trying to kill Lane and her friends, she was trying to get them to stop playing with the f***ing board and talking to Doris, who is actually evil as f***. With the stitches now off of Doris's corpse, her spirit is completely loose. The only person Lane can turn to for help is her grandmother, who reiterates something Paulina told Lane earlier in the film. The connection between Doris's spirit to our world is through her corpse in Debbie's basement and the Ouija board itself. To break this connection once and for all, Lane will have to burn Doris's corpse and the board at the same time. Lane, Sarah, and Trevor all go to Debbie's house to do this, but Trevor is killed by Doris. Eventually, Lane is able to burn Doris's corpse with the help of Sarah and Debbie's spirit. Just before Doris's spirit finally leaves our realm, she screams and what appears to be all of the spirits that were trapped inside of her leave her body and fly around the basement. Everything seems to be fine now for Lane until she goes home and discovers that the planchette, the piece used to navigate the writing on the Ouija board, has mysteriously appeared in her room. So that's Ouija. Not that bad, right? Well, apparently many people would disagree. Even though I enjoyed Ouija, I can understand the criticism surrounding the film. For one, Ouija was released at the height of another Blumhouse franchise, Insidious. There are many elements in Ouija that seem to be derivative of the Insidious series. Doris' mother is eerily similar to Parker Crane's mother in Insidious 2. The lanterns used in the Ouija seances are very similar to the ones used to navigate the Further. Both franchises have the involvement of Lin Shaye, and so on. I think these elements cause critics and audiences to view Ouija as a knockoff of what was, at the time, very popular horror entertainment. After all, the first Ouija was relatively well received by critics and audiences, even though its sequel had a more mixed reception. Another element that I believe caused many people to scoff at Ouija is its reliance on horror genre cliches and tropes. And by reliance, I mean that Ouija is filled to the brim with the oldest horror movie tropes in the book. But here's the thing, all of these elements are what make me enjoy the first Ouija film so much. Ouija is just the right film to show someone who is trying to dip their toes into the world of horror. There's something about the almost campy feel of Ouija that makes me really enjoy it. It nearly reminds me of a campfire story that you would tell to your friends. And going back to my original point, there's Ouija's interesting journey into being made into a film. I left off talking about the original version of Ouija that was cut into a trailer which was screened before The Fault in Our Stars. There's a lot of interesting stuff in this trailer, including an alternate death scene for Debbie and Isabel, and an entirely deleted scene where, who I can only assume is Doris, is hiding under the table during one of the seances to contact Debbie. A quick look at the promotional material for Ouija will show you that, due to the reshoots, the entire backstory for Doris had to be changed. Promotional photos of Doris have her looking like a Freddy Krueger-inspired spirit who constantly carries her creepy little doll around. All of this material has my filmmaking mind go crazy with what ifs. This scenario really reminds me of the remake of Black Christmas, which also went through a similar reshooting process where the film was drastically changed. That film even went so far as to film several scenes just for the trailer. Something about this really intrigues me. The idea that there are two versions of a film with similar yet completely different plots is fascinating. What's even more interesting about Ouija is that, due to its financial success, Universal and Blumhouse greenlit a sequel which actually ended up being a prequel. The sequel, titled Ouija Origin of Evil, was directed by one of the biggest names in horror at the moment, Mike Flanagan. Ouija Origin of Evil takes a much different approach to filmmaking than its predecessor. Focusing on its retro aesthetic, the film pays homage to many great classic horror films like Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist. Its focus isn't on stylish, clean digital cinematography and loud jump scares, rather it decides to play up a quiet, chilling atmosphere and leaves a lot to the imagination when it comes to the demonic spirits within the film. One of the things I love the most about the Ouija franchise as it stands so far is that it has left a lot of future story potential open-ended. No plans for an official third film in the Ouija franchise have been announced by Universal or Blumhouse, and it's been over 3 years since the last entry. At this point, I would say it's likely that we'll never see another sequel to this version of the franchise. However, I do feel that it's likely that the franchise will probably just see a reboot of sorts in the coming years. So that's my video on the Ouija franchise. Have you seen both of the Ouija movies? Which one did you like better? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure you give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more content. Until next time, my name is Colby King.